On the 41st floor of a tower with his own name on it, a man worth $4,310,000,000 sat in a hospital bed and could not remember his name. For 18 days, the people who shared his blood came only with lawyers. The one who came with breakfast had not worked for him in 6 years and was owed nothing by him. Not a wage, not a thank you, not even a goodbye. She made $15.75 an hour cleaning rooms that strangers passed through and forgot, and she had every reason in the world to stay home. There was a night, years before, that the two of them never spoke about in daylight, a night that cost him the one thing all his money had never once been able to protect. She was the only person alive who saw it happen, and in 6 years she had never told a single soul. This is the story of what a man's body remembers after his mind has let go of everything else, and of the woman who had every reason not to come and came anyway. Before we go any further, do one small thing for me. Wherever you are right now, a kitchen, a car in a parking lot, a night shift on a break that is almost over, tell me in the comments the name of your town and the time on your clock. I read everyone. And if you have ever been the person who showed up when nobody else did, stay to the end of this one, because it was written for you. Subscribe and tap the bell so the next story finds you. Octavia Mercer woke at 4:50 in the morning, 2 minutes before the alarm, the way her body had woken for 15 years, as if it refused to give a small machine the satisfaction of being needed. She lay still in the dark and listened to the building. The radiator ticked. The bus on the corner sighed away from the curb on its 6:05 schedule, which told her she had been right about the time again. She got up. Her apartment was one bedroom on the west side of Atlanta, near the bus line, the rent paid on the first of each month in a cashier's check, because she did not trust the way the world handled money that was hers. It was small, and it was orderly. The counters had the particular shine of a woman who believed dignity lived in the corners nobody else thought to check. The underside of the faucet, the track of the window, the back burner no one used. She had cleaned other people's homes for 15 years and had never once let her own go dirty. That was not pride. That was a kind of prayer. She made coffee, black, no sugar, in a heavy white mug with no pattern, because a pattern was a thing that asked for your attention, and she had spent her whole life giving hers to other people's mornings. She drank it at the window. The sky over the rooftops was turning the color of weak tea. A freight train was working through its couplings somewhere south of her, and she thought, the way she thought most mornings, of Eula. Eula Mercer had raised her in a narrow house with a porch that sagged on the left, and Eula had given her the one sentence she would build a life on. You do not leave a person who is hurting. You stay, even when staying is all you have to give. Octavia learned it for real at 19. Across the 4 months it took a cancer to take her grandmother slowly. She slept in the chair beside the bed. She learned the strange arithmetic of a body that is letting go, and near the end, when Eula could no longer say much, she asked only that somebody be in the room. Octavia was in the room. That was where she learned the thing she would later be paid almost nothing to do. The thing no school teaches anyone. How to subside suffering without trying to fix it. She learned the other half of it years afterward, and that half nobody warns you about. When her daughter was 4 and spent 6 nights in a hospital with pneumonia, Octavia stayed all 6 nights, and the family she cleaned for then, out in Sandy Springs, told her, of course, take what you need in the way that cost the speaker nothing, and then quietly stopped calling. A housekeeper is not an employee with leave to protect her. A housekeeper is a convenience, and a convenience that disappears for 6 nights is simply replaced. Here is a thing most people do not know, and it is true. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was written in 1938, the law that gave this country its minimum wage and its overtime hour, it left 2 kinds of workers out on purpose: farm workers and domestic workers, the maids and the cooks and the women who raised other people's children. They were cut out by design, and the shadow of that choice is still long. To this day, the federal family leave law reaches only employers with 50 or more workers, which means a woman who cleans one family's house has no legal right to the time the rest of us take for granted, not for a sick child, not for a dying grandmother, not for anything at all. Octavia did not read this in a book. She learned it the way the poor learn most things, by reaching for the protection where it should have been and closing her hand on air. She was raising the girl alone. 7 years old now, asleep down the short hall in the room with the better window, the one Octavia had given her so the child would wake to light. The father had been gone since before the girl was 2 and sent a card sometimes. There were nights Octavia sat at the kitchen table after the girl was down and did the math, the rent against the hours, the bus pass against the grocery list, and nights the math did not close, and she made it close anyway, by skipping the thing on the list that was only for her. The rent was $1,150 a month. She was $480 behind. carried over from the week her hours got cut after the holidays. She had never told a living soul how close to the edge it ran. Dignity, Eula used to say, is not having enough. Dignity is what you do with the little you have. On her lunch break, in the windowless staff room of a hotel called the Adair, where she cleaned 11 rooms a shift for $15.75 an hour, eating a turkey sandwich and an apple and drinking water she refilled from the tap because the machine charged $2 for what the faucet gave for free, she read the news on her phone the way she read everything, from the front backward, methodically. On the sixth screen down, she stopped. 3 paragraph notes. Atlanta developer critical condition after I-85 crash. It gave a name. It gave a date. It gave a hospital. She set the phone face down and did not pick the sandwich up again. And what moved through her in that fluorescent little room was not one clean feeling, but two that did not get along. The first was the old steadiness, the Eula in her, the part that already knew it would go. The second was something harder, closer to anger, a small voice that had been quiet for 6 years and now said plainly, he never once called you. Not when your hours were cut. Not when your husband of a job let you go. 6 years and a card would have cost him a stamp. She sat with both of them, the steadinesses and the anger, and she did not pretend the second one was not there. Then she reached into her purse and found the leather notebook and the tab she had cut from an index card 6 years before, and she did the only thing she knew how to do with a thing too heavy to carry and too important to set down. She decided to go. Going was not free. Her one full day off was Saturday, and Saturday was the day she did the week's wash and took the girl to the laundromat and the library, the 2 free hours that were theirs. She would have to ask Renata across the hall to watch the child, and Renata would say yes and would never take $1, which somehow made the asking harder, not easier. She would have to trade Tuesday's shift and lose the differential. She would have to put gas she did not have in a car she did not own, which meant the bus, which meant 90 minutes each way. She added it all up the way she added up everything, and the number did not close, and she decided to go anyway. That was the whole of it. The decision cost her something real, and she made it, and she told no one why. The man in the news had a name, and the name was Wendell Hargrove, and 3 weeks before a stranger's heart stopped behind the wheel of an SUV on Interstate 85, Wendell Hargrove had been the 7th wealthiest man in the state of Georgia. He was 64 years old, 6'2", with hands too large for the suits he wore, and calluses that 40 years of tailoring had never quite sanded away. He had started at 19 fixing other men's roofs in Macon for cash. He folded into small, neat rectangles and kept in his left pocket every bill facing the same direction. Because when you have almost nothing, you learn to know exactly where each dollar is. The habit never left him. At 24, he borrowed $4,200, bought a condemned duplex on the south side of Macon, gutted it with his own hands across one summer, rented both halves, and used the rent to buy the next one. 40 years on, he held 11 commercial towers, 3 mixed-use complexes still rising behind construction fence, and a headquarters in Midtown with his name on it in letters you could read from the interstate. Hargrove Development Partners, $4,310,000,000, built from nothing by one man who at 64 folded his money into small rectangles with the care of someone who remembered what it was to have exactly one. In a boardroom, his voice was quiet. Not soft quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a room lean toward a man rather than away. Not because he is unsure, but because he has no need to be loud, and it unsettled the people who worked for him more than shouting ever could. What the boardroom did not know, what the towers and the contracts and the letters on the building never told anyone, was the rest of it. He had been married to a woman named Adrian for 22 years and divorced for 8, and the divorce had left between them the kind of silence that is worse than any argument, the silence of 2 people who have simply stopped finding each other necessary. He had 2 grown children, Jermaine, 38, and Crystal, 34, both employed by the company in roles that had been created for them rather than earned, and Wendell knew this and never said it, believing that time would do what conversation could not. He was wrong about that, and he did not know it yet, and the not knowing had become its own kind of patience. He gave a great deal of money away through an office that handled it for him, and he had no real idea where most of it went, and that bothered him in a way he had taught himself not to examine. There is a loneliness that has nothing to do with being by yourself. It is the loneliness of walking into rooms that go quiet for the wrong reason, of being surrounded by people who are paid to be there, of owning so much that no one will ever again give you anything you did not buy. The house in Buckhead had 11,000 square feet and 1 occupant. The pool was cleaned on a schedule by men he never met, the lawn cut on Tuesdays by a service, so that on Tuesday evenings the grass had the smell of having been kept up, which is a different smell from grass that children play on. He ate most dinners standing at the kitchen island reading market reports off a tablet, and he slept in a room with a sitting area he had not sat in for 8 years. He had everything a man could measure and almost nothing a man could feel. Watch the daughter for a moment, because she matters more than she first appears. Crystal Hargrove had grown up with everything her father had clawed for, and she had taken from it exactly the wrong lesson. She measured people the way a developer measures a parcel, by what it could yield. She had never in her life done a thing that did not have a price attached, and she could not conceive of a person who had. She was, though no one had ever said it to her, and she would not have understood it if they had, the precise reproduction of the man her father had been at her age, before the towers, before the divorce, before the night in the kitchen. A person who believed that the world was a ledger, and that warmth was a line item you could choose not to fund. Her father, at 40 years, becoming someone else. He simply had not gotten around to telling her how, or that it was possible, or that it was the only thing that had ever mattered. There had been a list for that. He had written it 3 weeks before the crash and folded it into his jacket pocket. No one had read it yet. It was a Wednesday 9:42 in the evening, and Wendell was driving south on I-85 alone in a long black sedan, coming from the office toward a house in Buckhead that had been too large for one person for 8 years. He was in the left lane. The SUV came across the grass median at roughly 60 miles an hour, out of the northbound lanes and into his, and the impact was head-on. The other driver, it was later determined, had suffered a cardiac event and was gone before the cars ever touched. The front of the sedan folded inward like something trying to close itself. The airbag bloomed and died inside a single second, leaving a chemical smell that anyone who has lived through it never forgets. Fire and rescue reached him in seven minutes and needed 22 more to cut him free. Among the things the paramedics bagged from the wreck were a wallet holding 8 bills folded into small, neat rectangles, a phone with a cracked screen, a ring of keys, and one sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket, covered in his own handwriting. No one read it. They sealed it in a labeled bag and stored it in the closet of his hospital room, where it would stay, unfolded by anyone, for 11 weeks. He woke 4 days later in a private room at Brightwater Memorial and looked at the ceiling the way a newborn looks at light, not knowing what it was, but knowing it mattered. A nurse asked his name. He did not answer. She asked again, and he looked at her with an expression that was not quite confusion, something closer to the blankness of a man standing in a house he has never entered, opening doors onto rooms he does not recognize. He did not know his name. He did not know he had children. He did not know about the 11 towers, or the $4,310,000,000, or the letters on the building you could read from the highway. He knew only that his hands, resting on the white sheet, wanted to fold the hem of it into a small, neat rectangle, and he let them, because it was the one thing in the room that felt like his. The neurologist was Dr. Naomi Ferris, 23 years on the job and long past softening hard things into pleasant shapes. She sat the children down the next morning. Jermaine took the chair nearest the door. Crystal sat beside him, and behind her stood a man in a gray suit holding a leather folder, Dwayne Pell, her personal attorney, who had boarded the same flight from Miami and had not changed his clothes for it. Dr. Ferris explained it plainly. The condition was retrograde amnesia, caused by the traumatic brain injury he had sustained, with a Glasgow score of 6 on arrival and 7 hours of surgery behind him. In practical terms, it meant their father could speak, reason, decide whether the window should be open or closed. His present mind was intact. What was gone was everything behind it, his history, the name of his company, the faces of the 2 people in front of her, the 40 years of work they were now trying to protect. She told them more than 1 million Americans sustain a traumatic brain injury each year, and that a meaningful share of the most serious cases live with lasting memory loss, and that their father was among them. Then she told them the part that mattered most, watching their faces while she did. Recovery after a brain injury is not linear, and it does not follow a schedule, she said. It follows stimulation, familiar voices, familiar routines, familiar smells. The brain rebuilds along the paths it already knows, and the single most effective factor we have ever documented is the steady, repeated presence of people who knew the patient before the injury. She let the silence do its work. In plain language, it depends on who shows up. Jermaine looked at Crystal. Crystal looked at her phone. Dwayne Pell looked at no one. For 3 days they came, both of them 30 minutes and sometimes 45, and they sat in the chairs beside the bed and spoke to each other about the trust structure and the board's interim appointment and the quarterly filings that needed a signature they could not legally obtain. They spoke about these things in his presence, near his body, in his room, and not once to him. On the second day after they left, he asked the nurse a question. "Are those people my children?" She said yes. He was quiet a moment, and then he said, They don't seem comfortable here. She did not write it in the chart. She thought about it the rest of her shift. By the fourth day, Germaine came every other day, 15 minutes, then 12. By the sixth, Crystal stopped coming and called the desk instead, asking about competency assessments and guardianship timelines and rarely about how he felt, and never waiting for the whole answer when she did. On the eighth day, Germaine laid a medical power of attorney on the bedside table and slowly. The way you explain a thing to a man who does not understand English rather than a man who does not understand his own past, and Wendell could not read it. Not because the words were hard, but because they required a world he no longer had. But he could read the man. What he read was a person trying to reach the end of something as fast as the paperwork would allow. He did not sign. He said, "I would like to wait." Germaine took the document and left and did not come back. Days 9 through 17, no one came at all. A nurse named Latrice Bowen worked 3 shifts that week, and on the 14th day she wrote in his chart, "Patient calm, no visitors in 9 days. Patient cooperative. Patient asked today, 'Does anyone know I'm here?'" She set the pen down, read the line, and added nothing, because there was nothing to add. And on the 18th morning, while the light was still climbing the parking lot trees the way it did each day near 7:15, the door opened, and a woman came in with a folding chair under one arm and a small plastic container in her hand. She did not say his name. She did not ask whether he remembered her. She set the chair beside the window, sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and opened the container on the bedside table. Scrambled eggs, no salt, toast cut on the diagonal. He looked at the food a long time. Something in the angle of the toast and the plainness of the plate loosened his hands on the armrests in a way nothing had loosened them since he woke. He picked up the fork and ate slowly, in silence, and she did not watch him eat and did not ask if it was good. When the food was gone, she closed the lid, folded the napkin inside, picked up the chair, and said, "I'll come back tomorrow." After the door shut, he pressed the call button, and when Latrice came, he said the first full sentence he had spoken in 18 days. "The woman who was just here. She knew how I eat." It was not a question. Latrice wrote it down and underlined it once, and she sat at her station a while before she could move on to the next room. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the second day, she brought coffee, black, no sugar, in a heavy white mug with no pattern that she had found at a thrift shop on Peachtree Industrial for $1.75. Money she had meant for the girl's milk and bread, and had spent on a stranger's habit instead. It was not the same mug. It was the same kind. He reached for it, and his fingers closed on the handle and then slid to wrap the whole body of it, the way a hand wraps a thing it has held 1,000 times in the dark, and he turned it once and drank and said nothing, and neither did she. On the fourth day, she began to talk, not about his company or his fortune, but about the small things that lived in the notebook. "You woke at 5:15, she said, looking out the window and not at him. "You sat in the kitchen with only the light over the stove on. You never used the overhead. You said once it made the room feel like a hospital, and you wanted it to feel like a kitchen." He turned his head slightly. "I think I know that light," he said. She did not lean toward him and did not say, "You remember." She nodded once and let the sentence sit where it was. On the sixth day, Dr. Ferris stopped her in the hall. "He folds things," she said. "Paper, napkins, the edge of the sheet, into little rectangles. He doesn't know why. Octavius has said, he's done that since I knew him." And the doctor told her the thing that turns a kindness into a treatment. "We tend to think who you are is stored in the events you remember," she said. "It isn't. Identity is spread across systems. The memory of events lives in the hippocampus, and that's what he's lost. But the memory that lives in the body, the kind that lets you tie a shoe or fold paper into a shape your fingers learned 20 years ago, that's in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, and it's intact. And the part that tells the body who is safe, that's the amygdala, and that may be the most intact of all. He can't give you a single name, but his body knows who to relax for." She looked at Octavia a long moment. "What you're doing isn't a visit," she said. "It's the only thing in this building that's working. His verbal output goes up about 40% the mornings you come. His blood pressure settles. Those aren't opinions, they're numbers on the monitor." On the 11th day, the family found out, and the day they found out is the day this stops being a quiet story. Germaine called the desk for the first time in 11 days, and Latrice, in good faith, told him his father's regular visitor was there right now if he cared to leave a message. There was a silence on the line, not a pause, a silence, the kind that comes when a person hears something they were not prepared for and has to rearrange the furniture in their mind before they can speak. What regular visitor? 40 minutes later, he and Crystal came down the fourth floor corridor, side by side, at the pace of people with somewhere to be and something to prevent. And they found Octavia coming out of the room with the empty container in one hand and the folding chair under her arm. Crystal spoke first. Octavia said, visiting. Crystal said, you don't work for us anymore. You were let go 6 years ago. And Octavia, very still, said, I was let go by your mother, not your father. And I'm not here for work. Crystal did not raise her voice. She did something colder. She opened the leather folder Dwayne Pell held out to her, removed a single sheet and a cashier's check, and held them out across the hallway as though they were the most reasonable objects in the world. Then let me make this simple, she said. $50,000. You sign this, you don't come back, and you and I never have to have this conversation again. I'm sure a woman in your position can find a use for it. And here is the part the story needs you to see, because it is the truest part. Octavia looked at the check. She did not look at it the way a proud woman looks at an insult. She looked at it the way a tired woman looks at a thing she has needed for 6 years. $50,000 was the $480 she was behind on rent, and the next 10 years of being behind. It was the girls' braces and the girls' college and the nights the math did not close. For one full second, in front of the daughter who had offered it, precisely because she believed every person had a price, Octavia wanted to take it. She was not a saint. She was a woman who was tired, and the money was real, and the temptation was real, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never been $480 behind. Then she folded her hands back into her lap of air and said, very quietly, no, ma'am. Crystal blinked. I'll go to 75. Octavia said, you don't understand. There's no number. I'm not here for what I can get. I'm here for what I already owe. And Crystal, who had never in her life met a debt that could not be paid in dollars, stood holding a check that the heir had refused. And for the first time, something crossed her face that was not contempt. It was closer to fear. Because if this woman could not be bought, then there existed a kind of value Crystal had spent her whole life unable to see. And the not seeing suddenly looked less like cleverness and more like blindness. Dr. Ferris came around the corner then and took in the check, the folder, the two of them. But before she could speak, a voice came from inside the room, low, certain, the boardroom quiet that makes a room lean in. She stays. They turned. Wendell was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, thinner than his suits remembered, his eyes clear. He did not know their names. He knew, the way the amygdala knows, who in that hallway had come with eggs and who had come with a folder. I don't remember much, he said. But I'm told my mind works, and I'm told I can decide who comes into my own room. I decide she does. He looked at Crystal, and something old and buried moved behind his eyes, not memory, but recognition of a shape. Put the money away, he said. You should never have taken it out. The corridor was very quiet. Crystal put the money away. It came back to him on her 14th visit, not as a flood, but the way light returns to a room at dawn, the corners resolving out of the dark until the room is a room again. They were sitting in the quiet that was not empty, the coffee finished, the light at the middle of the floor, and Wendell said without turning his head, there was a kitchen. She did not move. The light was over the stove. It was late, not morning. She said, yes. His hands were still on the armrests. I was at the table, he said, and he stopped. He looked at his hands. I was crying. Not the way a person cries when something happens. The way a person cries when they've held a thing so long the holding became the wound, and one night it opens on its own. He was quiet. I don't remember what was true, but I remember the crying, and I remember you were there, and I remember you didn't look away. 6 years before, 2 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen in the Buckhead house, the overhead light off, the stove lamp throwing its small warm circle on the counter, and leaving the rest in the kind of dark that makes a vast kitchen feel like a small safe place. Adrian had told him that morning she wanted a divorce, and he had nodded and gone to work and run a meeting and signed documents and driven home and eaten alone, because she had already moved to the guest room. And at 2 in the morning, at the table, the wound had opened, and the thing he could not bear was not that he was losing his wife. It was that he was not sad to lose her, and that this said something about the last 20 years he could not look at directly. Octavia had come down for water and found him. She had not gone to him. She had not asked what was wrong, had not offered the cheap mercy of words. She had turned on the stove, made coffee in the dark, set the plain white mug beside his hands, and sat down across the table and stayed, saying nothing, until his breathing came back to him. Then she had washed the mug, dried it, put it away, and gone upstairs. For a man who had spent 45 years making sure no one ever saw him without the mask, being witnessed in collapse was the most exposing thing that had ever happened to him. It cost him the one thing his fortune had never been able to buy or guard, which was the belief that he was made of something harder than other men, and she gave it back to him. Not with comfort, with silence, and with the next morning, when she appeared in the kitchen at 5:15 and started the coffee and said nothing, as though the night had changed nothing, as though he were exactly the man he had always been. She never told a soul. 3 weeks later, filed, And in the machinery of the divorce, she dismissed the entire household staff. And Octavia was gone. And Wendell did not learn she was gone until the papers were final. And by then, he did not know how to reach across the thing that had happened in that kitchen. So he did not. For 6 years, he carried it. And 3 weeks before the crash, he finally decided to. There was a bag, he said to Latrice one afternoon. From the car, my things. Is it still here? She brought it. He opened it, the wallet with the folded bills, the cracked phone, the keys, and the single sheet of paper, and he unfolded the paper and read it again. It was a list in his own hand. Call Germaine, birthday Thursday. Then a second line. Octavia Mercer, find current address, Foundation for Care Workers, Housing and Health. He read the second line 3 times. He had been looking for her. Before the median, before the cardiac event in a stranger's chest, before any of it, he had written her name on a piece of paper and put it in his pocket and had not reached the next step because the world ended at 9:42 on a Wednesday night. He held the paper out to her across the bed. She took it. She read her own name in his handwriting, and she was very still, and the anger she had carried into the building 18 days before, the small 6-year-old voice that said he never called, went quiet at last, because here was the answer, late and broken and true. He said, it just didn't get there in time. Octavia looked at the name. She folded the paper the way she folded everything, with precision and care, and put it in the pocket of her coat, and she said, you got there. He met with his children before he left the hospital, and these were not summaries. They were the hardest conversations of his life. Germaine came first. He sat across the bed and started with the company, the structure, the board, and Wendell let him talk, and then said, tell me one thing. The night they called you, where were you? Germaine was quiet. Then, because his father's clear and unremembering eyes left him nowhere to hide, he said, a fundraiser, a pause. I finished the conversation I was having before I left, and he heard it out loud for the first time what kind of sentence that was, and his face came apart, and he said, I don't know when I became the man who would do that. I keep trying to remember, and I can't. Wendell said, neither can I remember when I became the man who raised him, so we're even. Crystal was harder. She came once, alone, without Pell, which was itself the only apology she knew how to make. She did not cry. She stood at the window with her back to him and said, I offered her money because I thought everyone took money. I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I was about that. And I was wrong, and I don't know what to do with being wrong. Wendell said, you do what I'm doing. You start over, and you let someone show you how. It's not too late. It was almost too late for me. She did not answer, but did not leave either. And for Crystal, that was a great deal. Wendell Hargrove was discharged 11 weeks after the crash, Doctor. Ferris signed the papers on a Thursday and told him his memory had returned to roughly 85%, that small gaps would remain. A name here, a date there, rooms he had stood in that he would never fully see again. That's normal, she said. Brains aren't filing cabinets, they're rivers. Some of the water finds its way back to the old channel. Some of it finds a new one. He thanked her. She said, don't thank me, thank the woman with the eggs. He restructured the company before he did anything else. Germaine and Crystal were removed from the roles that had been built for them. They could return, he told them, but they would start where he had started, at the bottom, the way everyone who earns a thing has to start. 2 board members resigned. Dwayne Pell sent a letter and got no reply. None of it moved him, because a man who has lost his whole memory and won most of it back does not frighten over a thing as small as a board. Then he built the thing the list had named. He sat with accountants and housing people and a hospital administrator and asked them a question none of them had a clean answer for. How is a woman who cleans rooms for a living supposed to take a week off when her child is in the hospital? And who pays her rent while she does? There are roughly 2.5 million domestic workers in this country, most of them women, a great many of them women of color, and the labor they do, the lifting and bathing and feeding of the old and the sick and the dying, is some of the hardest and least protected work there is. He had spent his life raising towers that held up nothing but themselves. He decided to spend the rest of it building something that held up the people who held up everyone else. It was not penance. He did not believe in penance. It was simply the most useful thing he could think to do with a fortune he had nearly died without ever once enjoying. He named it the Mercer Foundation, and when he drove to her apartment on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after discharge to tell her so, he climbed 1 flight of stairs and knocked, and she opened the door in a clean blouse, and behind her the apartment was small and orderly, with a table and 2 chairs that had never both been used at once until that day. She did not say, come in. She stepped aside. She sat. She went to the stove and made scrambled, no salt, and toast cut on the diagonal, and poured black coffee into a plain white mug, and they sat in the quiet of that kitchen for 20 minutes the way they had once sat in another. before either of them knew the silence would matter this much. When it had passed, he told her the name. She said, "You don't have to put my name on it." He said, "I want the name of somebody who showed up. That's the whole point." She looked at the window where the light had moved off the table to the counter, and she said, Eula would have liked that. It was the first time in all the years he had known her that she had spoken her grandmother's name in his presence, and it sat in the room the way good things sit, gently, asking nothing. A year and a half later, the foundation had moved 61 families of home health aides and hotel housekeepers and hospital custodians into stable housing, and had paid for the cancer screenings of more than 400 people who spend their lives turning and lifting and feeding other human beings and had never once had the leave or the coverage to be screened themselves. Octavia ran the part that mattered most, the part that decided who got help and how, because she was the only one in the building who knew from the inside what a working woman could not afford to say out loud, and she built the intake form so that no one ever had to beg. She had enrolled at 35. In the night classes she had set aside for half her life, the ones that would make her a licensed nurse, because she had decided her daughter should grow up, watching her mother become a thing she chose rather than a thing she settled for. The $480 was long paid. The girl had her own room with more than one good window and a shelf of library books that no longer had to go back. And on the Saturday the foundation placed its 100th family, the girl asked her mother why she went and sat with the old man who couldn't remember anyone back when nobody made her. And Octavia thought about how to say it to a child and finally said, "Only this. Because once your great-grandmother taught me that you don't leave a person who's hurting. You stay, even when staying is all you've got." The girl nodded the way children nod at things they will not understand for 20 years and then understand all at once. There is a photograph in the lobby of the foundation now, small, framed in plain wood, hung at the height where a person actually looks. It is not a picture of Wendell Hargrove, and it is not a tower or a check or a groundbreaking. It is an empty kitchen table with 2 chairs and a white mug catching the morning light, and beneath it, in Octavia's hand, one line the staff voted to keep when she tried to take it down. It says, "Someone sat with me once and said nothing." That was everything. On Sundays, a man in a plain dark coat sometimes sits in the back pew of a church on Simpson Road, a billionaire that not one person in the building can name, listening to a choir sing the kind of song that is not about being perfect, but about not stopping. Crystal came with him once. She did not sing. But she came and she stayed the whole service, and afterwards she stood a long time looking at nothing, learning, late, the thing her father had nearly died to learn. Some debts cannot be paid back. They can only be passed on. This story is fiction. Wendell and Octavia, the towers, the crash on I-85, the foundation, none of it happened in the way I have told it. But the bones are real and worth knowing. More than 1 million Americans live through a traumatic brain injury every year, and the science Dr. Ferris describes is true. Emotional and procedural memory often outlast the memory of events, and the most powerful force in a person's recovery is not a drug, but the steady presence of someone familiar. The other truth is quieter and older. When this country wrote the law that created the minimum wage, it deliberately left out domestic workers and farm workers, and that shadow still falls on the roughly 2.5 million people, most of them women who clean our rooms and raise our children and sit beside our dying, often without the leave or the coverage the rest of us assume is ours by right. I wrote this because I have come to believe we live in a world that measures people by what they own, and that we are nearly always wrong about it. The ones who matter, in the moments that actually matter, are not the names on the buildings. They are the ones who show up with scrambled eggs, in silence and do not leave. Now I want to leave you with one question, and it has nothing to do with the money or the towers or the hospital room. It is about the person in your own life who showed up when no one else did. The one who sat with you when sitting was the only thing left to do. The one who remembered how you take your coffee on a day you'd forgotten your own name. Maybe it was a grandmother. Maybe a neighbor who never once took $1. Maybe a stranger on the worst night you ever had. Maybe it was you, quietly, for somebody who never said thank you in words but said it by remembering. Write that person's name in the comments below. Just the name. That is enough. That is everything. And if this story found something real in you, do one small thing with it. Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that showing up is never small. Because somewhere out there, a person remembers exactly how you take your coffee, and they are not finished with you yet. If stories like this one are what you come here for, the ones about dignity and the long memory of kindness, then like this video so the next person can find it. Leave your comment so I know you were here, subscribe, and turn on the bell so the next story comes to you the moment it goes out. We tell one every week, and I would hate for you to miss it. Until then, take care of the people who take care of you. Stay kind, stay blessed, and never underestimate the power of one quiet act of love.